Hello, Dragon Slayers. I wanted to comment today about the very substantial conflict in our society that has emerged over the past year. I'm not talking about the election, I'm talking about how we view each other as a culture. I have emerged, as many of you have, of my generation, from a culture that spoke of America as a melting pot that would take ingredients from each unique culture, add to it, celebrate it, ultimately to become one people, a union. Uh, our children were raised with that understanding. Our children were taught to say the Pledge of Allegiance. We were taught American history from a more heroic perspective than today. Admittedly, in our history, there are movements that we need to be concerned about. There are elements in our history that represent evil, but on the other hand, if we look at the whole course of American history, I believe, and many of my generation also believe, that we were moving in the right direction. Most recently, we have been divided, I believe, by social and political forces that wish to tear us apart. The idea of honoring each of us as individuals ought to be celebrated. The idea of inclusion ought to be celebrated. But on the other hand, the ideas of dividing us into conquered and conquerors, oppressors and oppressed, ultimately proves to be an exhaustion of energy and destructive to the underlying integrity of our country. Uh, we grew up, in my generation, honoring the U.S. Constitution and honoring the idea that we need to confer on all citizens our rights and our protection. Recently, that also has been diluted. The 1619 Project speaks to America being a product of an effort to enslave Black people. Well, certainly that was an element in American history, but as of the Civil War, and subsequently coincident to the civil rights legislation in the 1960s, we made a very clear statement that we are no longer going to tolerate oppression of one people over another. Recently, on our college campuses, we've seen a rage emerging targeting Jewish students and providing an abundance of misinformation about what's going on today in the Middle East. And I'd like to take some time and read from the work of a Harvard professor, Jeffrey Bonenfeld. I'm sorry. I'd like to read from the work of a Harvard professor, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, published in January of this year. Professor Sonnenfeld was commenting about the level of ignorance that we have today about the October 7th Hamas atrocities. We have not been exposed to the full evidence of that, I believe, because the atrocities were so horrifying that it's not something that would be subject to national viewing. On the other hand, when we hear demonstrators deny that the atrocities actually occurred, it brings unfortunate echoes of what happened in Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s. I'll remind people that it was not until Dwight Eisenhower discovered the Nazi concentration camps and made clear the atrocities committed by the Nazis that the American people had a full sense of how horrifying that was. Let me read from Professor Sonnenfeld's work for a moment. Reports from the World Forum at Davos spoke of the disappointment that the sensitive topic of rising global anti-Semitism after the Hamas attacks on Israel received. After the world leaders in Davos were shown film evidence of the atrocities, people walked out of the room in silence, simply crying or were shell-shocked. Having now attended several such screenings of this exact same film, I saw leaders react in similar horror to the visual evidence of the butchery which once witnessed and can never be unseen. But it must be seen. Leaders across sectors, nations, and religions must view the IDF footage, IDF, the Israeli Defense Force footage, to understand viscerally and emotionally that the atrocity deniers are wrong. A little bit about the history of how the IDF came to capture these video footages. What had happened is that the Hamas terrorists had taken videos almost to celebrate what they had done. And they were celebrating were the killing of children, the beheading of children, raping, and brutalizing all of their victims. And I should say there were 1,200 victims in that initial October 7th invasion. Now, recently, our president has responded to the anti-Semitism on campus with the most tepid presidential response of recent times. I do recall, I was old enough to remember this, when President Eisenhower sent down the National Guard to Arkansas to permit the integration of schools in Arkansas. Similarly, John Kennedy in 1962 did the same kind of thing. So it's very possible that a president can mobilize the Justice Department and other forces to certainly minimize suffering and to stand squarely on the side of democracy and embracing all people. President Biden didn't do that. You heard nothing about wanting to mobilize the Justice Department to find out the source of these anti-Semitic demonstrations. Subsequently, if anybody wishes to investigate, many of the sources that are funding this come from Iran, Hamas, dark money, and sadly, a number of wealthy donors to progressive causes. There's nothing progressive about anti-Semitism anymore. There's anything progressive about the oppression of Black people, the oppression of Native Americans, or any other kind of oppression. I believe that the president's equivocation on this issue springs largely from his fear of the retaliation that might come within his party from those who don't share the sentiments of most American people. I believe that his caution relates to the fact that there are a number of Islamic people living in Michigan, although I doubt seriously, having had friends who are Muslim, that President Biden's appraisal of the Islamic perspective is as simplified as he's been counseled. At any rate, I wanted to put this idea forward. I think it warrants attention. I think it is a source of distress. And I encourage our listeners to proceed and investigate on your own how the Palestinian situation came about, how we're reacting to this, and how we can be very vigilant about the potential that forces who intend no goodwill for this country are intentionally dividing us. Thank you for your attention. I wish you well. And I look forward to talking to you next time about more pleasant subjects. Goodbye.